So hopefully you can all see the screen that I've shared. I'm afraid you can't see me because we had our first technical hitch, which was that my webcam decided to stop working this morning, just to add to the stress of our first webinar. But anyway, hopefully you just 10 minutes, a very brief introduction to Wessex Community Assets and the work that we're doing around community-led housing. So that's me, 10 minutes. And then Colin is going to give a presentation on community-led housing in more depth. And then there'll be a question and answer session for 20 minutes. So we're hoping that we'll be finished in an hour at 2 o'clock. Okay, so Wessex Community Assets. We're part of a group, we're a community benefit society, and we were set up about 15 years ago as part of the group with a particular focus on helping communities access land and access finance. So about 3 years ago, we got some funding to develop the Wessex Community Housing Hub, and this is what we're kind of launching officially at the moment. So it's a technical support hub to enable community housing projects. We work across 3 counties. We helped 20 communities to complete projects, and we're working with another 40 communities at the moment. So just a bit of background. We actually started working Wessex on community housing in about 2001. For about a decade, we worked on a smaller number of what we call standalone community land trust projects, such as Buckland Newton in Dorset and High Bickington in Devon. Now, these were very successful projects, but they took a long time. High Bickington took about 12 years, Buckland Newton took about 7 years. So after that experience, we tried to find ways to make the process easier, and we developed partnerships with a number of housing associations. And this remains a very important part of our work. So on screen, you'll see some houses that Christo Community Land Trust developed with teen housing. And these are passive houses, very high energy efficiency, because the local people said, we want the people who live in these houses to, well, we want it to be affordable forever, really, not just the actual building and the rent, but actually the cost of running the houses also to be affordable. So this is a map of the projects that we're currently involved with across the region. This is a picture of some of the houses that communities have developed. These are some of the logos of the various community land trusts that we've helped set up. So as I say, there's about 60 now. So that's created a very strong kind of peer support network between those community land trusts as well. And then, very importantly, these are the housing associations that we've sort of enabled partnerships between community land trusts and these housing associations. And the housing associations, their role, Colin will explain more, but their role is to support the communities at the sort of the planning stage, but also to secure finance and manage the development process, which can be very risky for communities. So, as I mentioned, about 3 years ago, we got funding from various sources, the Nationwide Foundation, recently the fund from community-led homes. And up to this point, a lot of our work was through what we called the Wessex Community Land Trust Project. and that focused very much on the community land trust partnerships with housing associations. And although those will continue to be probably the majority of projects that we see across the region, we also wanted to support the development of other types of community-led housing. And so we got this funding to create the Wessex Community Housing Hub. And taking that idea of a sort of hub and spokes, I'm just going to talk very briefly about 6 elements. So Colin will go into that in much more detail. So the first is that we offer a registration service. So most of the community land trusts that have been formed across the country are community benefit societies, which is the same kind of structure that housing associations generally use. So we've registered 60 of those, but we also work with other types of structure like charities or community interest companies. But the most important point is that any structure that we work with must be an asset-locked structure. So the second thing, which I also mentioned, is that we're developing this either completed housing projects or are in the process of developing housing projects. And this gives an enormous body of experience that is being shared across the network around things like governance, the challenges that groups face, and also sort of new ideas that people are coming up with. With the hub funding, we've employed Colin as a community housing advisor, but we also have a pot of money for groups to be able to access support from specialist technical advisors. So that's another element of the support. Some of the community groups that we support, because they have adopted a community benefit society structure, they're types of social enterprise project. And so, for example, Norton-sub-Hamden CLT has taken on the shop and the post office. Queen Camel Community Land Trust has raised funds to buy an old school and turn it into workspace. So that's another element of support that we offer. We're very keen to promote innovation, and this is an example where we worked with the Bridport Co-housing Group and Dorset Community Energy to explore the feasibility of a PV microgrid on the 53 houses. And then also we have a strong interest in sustainability. So for example, we've been working recently with Assemble, some very interesting architects, and we're exploring the use of local materials, particularly timber, but also fibres and clay in affordable housing. We're exploring possibilities around what are called non-permanent dwellings or tiny houses, and we've got some funding to run some workshops. A couple of groups in Mendip and in Torbay that are looking at purchasing and refurbishing properties. We're taking inspiration from this example, which is just in Liverpool, which has been involved in that kind of work. And then just to finish off, just to mention that our Wessex Community Housing Hub, it's part of a national network of 28 hubs across the whole country. We've been supported through this national consortium called Community-Led Homes, which has received government funding to support these 28 hubs. The last thing I would say about that is that I mentioned at the start that we support activity across Devon, Dorset and Somerset, but our specific funding from community-led homes only allows us to support groups in Dorset and Somerset through the work of Colin MacDonald and our technical advisors. We are still continuing to support groups in Devon through other means, but just to clarify that. So I hope that that gives you a bit of an introduction to Wessex and a bit of introduction to the Wessex Community Housing Hub. And now I'm going to pass over to Colin, and Colin is going to talk to you in more detail about the different types of community-led housing and the kind of support that we're able to offer.
Right. Hello, everyone. No. There is share the screen. So hopefully you can all hear me and you can see the slides that I've just set up. So my name is Colin MacDonald, and for those of you that don't know me, I've been working with Wessex Community Housing Hub since it was created, and that's what I look like. So this presentation will cover what is community-led housing, what its key defining features are, 5-stage approach model, and some of the main types. And hopefully at the end of that, you'll have a clear idea of community-led housing in the round. So first of all, what is community-led housing? Well, there are a number of features of community-led housing, and as you can see, one of them is it directly benefits a community. It involves long-term community ownership or stewardship. It has meaningful community engagement. It's not for profit, and the housing that's created is affordable to local people. So the kind of emerging national definition is this one, that community-led housing involves local people playing a leading and lasting role in solving housing problems, creating genuinely affordable homes and strong communities. So what do we mean by affordable housing? Well, again, there's a kind of a definition that's emerged nationally, and this is pretty much the definition that the government used, but it's my phrasing and my word in green, that housing is available to people who can't otherwise afford housing in the local market. And I think the word prevailing is important there because, of course, the occupation costs, be that the price or the rent for different types of housing, will change over time, and of course people's earnings will change over time. So the issue of being able to afford it today doesn't necessarily mean that the same people will be able to afford the same housing tomorrow. Typically, it comes in 3 main types: for rent, where the rent is significantly lower than private rent; for sale, where there's a discounted price in the sale, and that discount is there available for future occupants so that they never have to pay the full price; and shared ownership, which is kind of halfway house model, part buy and part rent. Going back to rent, there's 2 main models there. Up until recently, the government's preferred form of new social housing has been affordable rent, which is defined as rent being up to 80% of the market rent. One caveat there is 80% of the market rent that would be charged for that particular property. And then the social rent, which is really calculated on a different basis. In much of Somerset and Dorset, it's probably equivalent to around 60% or maybe 65% of the equivalent market rent, but it isn't calculated on a different system. And the key thing about social rent is that pretty much wherever you are, it's about the lowest form of rent you'll be able to find. But the key thing about all of this is this bit: it's in perpetuity. It's not really affordable housing if it's only available to, let's say, the first generation of occupants. And yeah, good example of that might be the government's Help to Buy scheme, where clearly people are getting a form of soft loan to get into home ownership, but that isn't passed on to anybody else. They have to repay that loan eventually, and they've benefited from that sort of short-term lower cost, but only them. So, what are the main types of community-led housing? There are all sorts of types of community housing, and I liken this slide to one of those thick cardboard books that you might have with young children or grandchildren, where you have nothing but opposites, tall and short and red and blue. Well, it could be urban, it could be rural, it could be new build, it could be refurbishment, and it could be schemes that are owned by the residents. It could be a scheme that's owned by the community as a whole. Really, community-led housing could be all sorts of things. And as Tim was referring to earlier, Wessex has a huge history of working in schemes which are largely rural and largely new build. And there are community-led housing schemes going on all over the country that are quite different from that. Another way of looking at the types of community-led housing is this diagram, where you can see some of the main types on one side of the Venn diagram, some of the main types on the other side of the Venn diagram. And really, this is just a broad brush approach, and that overlap is bigger than that diagram would suggest. But what we have on the left is where you're providing homes for yourself or your group, such as in cooperative housing, mutual home ownership. And on the right is where you're providing homes for your community. And implicitly, but not necessarily, that might mean not for yourself particularly, but for other people in your community. But as I said, really that overlap is bigger than that. All forms of community-led housing have these four key features. That the not-for-profit organisation that's set up to benefit a specific community, that owns land or buildings which are important to the community. The and or other assets there is, in the case of the community land trust model, it might be something else other than just land or buildings, but not in all models. That ownership is in stewardship, so they remain available and affordable for the community into the future, and that there's democratic control. Generally, the organisation is open to membership by anyone in the community that supports its aims. One important exception is a fully mutual housing co-op. In the case of a fully mutual housing co-op, you'd expect members to be tenants or prospective tenants, vice versa, to be a tenant you need to be a member. But it's still democratically controlled. It's just not open to membership by anybody. Over the years, colleagues in Wessex tell me that these have been the key common motivations behind successful schemes. First of all, the desire for leadership in an important local project, and the desire to achieve broad community support. So not just within the group itself that's doing it, but across wider sections of the community. And often, but not always, a lack of trust in outside organisations on some of the key questions. So, for example, the site selection, the design, the numbers, whether occupancies by local people. So those have been the key motivations that Wessex has come across in the past however many years it's been. Who benefits from it? Well, people on average to low incomes who wouldn't otherwise afford market prices or rent in their local community. People with a connection to the community where their homes are created. That could be through residency or work or family. Or people who are part of the intended community. I'll explain a little bit about it shortly. There are also benefits for the whole community. I'm not going to read all of these out, and I was previously told that this slide might be a bit busy and have too much writing on it, and my view of that is that's because there's lots of benefits for the whole community. One that comes to mind immediately is that middle one, that you can make sure that housing is built that actually fits, not a pattern book um, standard development, not an estate that you could stand in and not know which part of the country you're in. It's something that actually fits with the local vernacular and helps your community to grow in an organic way. So nationally, there's been emerging this 5-step model. Um, and I think it's really helpful to look at these 5 simple stages. It really does help concentrate the mind on what the key elements are. But I have a huge caveat, which is that real life isn't simple. Every project is different, and you often find yourself saying, I wouldn't start from here. So in reality, we might start in a different place and work our way around this model, but all the same, here is the 5-stage model community-led housing normally develops. The first is group. So you have to ask those questions: who do you want to house? What difference will you make? One of the questions I have in my mind is often, if you didn't do this, what would happen anyway? Which might help focus the mind on where it is that you can make the biggest difference. And in forming a group and taking forward a community-led team, you'll need time and enthusiasm and a modicum of common sense. You don't necessarily have to have people in the group who have specific skills that you might think are useful. I mean, it would be useful if one person happened to be an architect. It might be useful if another person happened to be a lawyer. But those are things that you can buy in if you're clear about what you want to do and you've got the time to do it. So often it's start with a steering group and think about these other 4 stages before deciding exactly what sort of formal group you'll have. So the other 4 stages, which are more sequential, first is site. I like to say, if Mrs. Beaton did community-led housing, she would clearly say, first find your site. Often, and particularly in rural contexts, we use what we call a sequential test, but put simply, really, it's a question of looking at all the possible sites around you that might be fit for the purpose and putting them into some sort of order of your preferred site, your second preferred site, your third preferred site, and then finding out that actually your first site is owned by someone who's never going to let go of it and won't want to work with you and you can't have it. And the second site is inhabited by some rare species that you can't rehome and is therefore not suitable. And the third site, highways feel it's not possible to get into safely from the nearest highway. And so you end up with your 4th site or 5th site, whatever. But the key thing is to rank sites in preferred order and then see how you might have to change that in the light of reality. Sometimes a site is gifted. There's a wonderful example in, I think it's Tolopracorum, where the site was gifted by somebody to build some houses, and it had the wonderful proviso of, as long as one of those properties includes a new post office. So the site could be gifted, and that gifted might come with its own strings. Could be that the site is actually there. What you really want to do is address an eyesore, make better use of that piece of infill land or that building. And whatever you look at, the site will have some constraints. There are going to be things about the site that needs to be addressed, where you'll need some advice and support. Next stage is plan. What is it you want to create? Inevitably, it's going to involve engaging an architect. You're going to have to think about making best use of the site. So again, in the past, we've often looked at things like what we call passive solar gain, where you might want to make sure you've oriented properties in the best possible aspect. And then there's planning permission, and you will need planning permission, and that will be something that you'll need to navigate your way through. And often with planning permission, but not always, you may well need to provide what your evidence base is, justifies gaining permission for the particular kind of housing you want on that particular site. Then there's build. Well, in this context, build includes renovate. It could be self build. It could be building social, such as a housing association, or of course these days local housing authorities are also back in the business of building houses. And it could be handed over from another developer. It could be something that's been produced as affordable housing through planning gain, and the developer is obliged to hand over a not-for-profit type organisation. And finally, there's live. And you might think that's the easy bit, the hard bit's all done, but think about things like the allocations policy and process, who's going to manage and maintain the homes into the future, how are you going to sustain the commitment into the longer term, and how much direct involvement will there be of the residents that are living there. Anyway, when you put all of those together, you have a 5-stage model. And as you can see, 4 of those are clearly in sequence. Group kind of encompasses everything, partly because you need to have a strong group all the way through, and partly because you need to think about all of these stages before formally creating the group. And hopefully you can see the subtle dotted line there that indicates the journey through those stages. So a quick word about the main vehicles that you could use to create community-led housing. We've already mentioned community land trusts, which we have a huge experience of, and non-profit organisations holding land or buildings in trust for the benefit of the community. So passes the Ron Seal test, does on the tin, and that gives us our asset log. It's very popular, and you can see here a picture of the Community Land Trust of Norton Hampden. On the right are the 10 homes that were built in conjunction with the Arlington Housing Association, and on the left is the shop that the Community Land Trust then went on to over when the people who were running it were due to retire. And as you can see, it's a popular vehicle for delivering affordable community-led housing, but also you can have these other projects. It could be, post office, we've looked at solar arrays and so on. And we've got experience of community land trusts partnering with a housing association. There's kind of 2 approaches. One where the community land trust owns the freehold of the land and the housing association the long-term lease. So the community land trust leads on these key issues, and the housing association funds, develops, and operates and owns the accommodation. The other is where the community land trust registers as a housing association, or the correct term is registered provider, in its own right, and then access grant itself to develop the homes, but it contracts with a housing association, an existing housing association, to do the development and possibly the management. Either of these models, the way I would describe this is that the people in the community land trust are in control of the process, and compromises will have to be made, but they're the key people deciding which compromise to make. And the housing association is doing the heavy lifting, it's bringing in its expertise, and to some extent its reputation with parts of the industry and lenders and so on, and is in a very good position to help the community land trust through the process. And there's cooperative housing, and these are, as we've already mentioned, non-profit organisations based on democratic membership, basically there to provide and collectively manage, and they're often fully mutual. But otherwise, they could be all sorts of things. They could own the homes they manage. They could be leasing those homes from another organisation. They could be managing properties that actually belong to a different landlord, where effectively they're a tenant management organisation. Then there's co-housing. So these are intentional communities. These are the ones that are created and run by their residents. In that sense, they have a lot in common with. They can mix tenures and also different degrees of equity. Usually each household is a self-contained home, but they also have some communal space. There could be some time spent collectively, such as sharing meals. And it's a photograph of the Threshold Centre in Liam, which was developed by what is now Astor Housing Association. And another form of that is mutual home ownership. It's an opportunity here to have different intermediate incomes in different equity stake in the homes, and the residents form a mutual home ownership society, which then owns and manages the homes collectively. And residents can pay a rent that's based on their household income. So I've remembered correctly, the scheme that I have in mind, which is Lilac in Leeds, I think it's based on 35% of income. So it doesn't matter how much or how little you earn, you're making proportional costs. And then there's group self-build. Now, I've often said self-build could be undertaken by individuals, but you're Mr. and Mrs. Self-Builder, you don't need a community-led housing hub, you need Channel 4. If you're doing it collectively, then it's a community-led scheme. So self-builders might undertake most of the work, or just some of it. It could be that they use contractors for some elements. It could be that they do everything themselves. And one common variation is self-finish. So the standard contractor would bring the properties up to watertight, weatherproof stage, and the self-builders would go in and do the fixing and finishing. Sometimes it's organised by another body. I've got an example in mind of where a housing association ran a self-build scheme, and effectively it was a training scheme that the self-builders were developing practical skills under supervision of skilled people. And in all cases, the costs can be reduced by what we call sweat equity. The amount of time that you've put into the build yourself reduces the construction costs, and that equates through to either a lower price that you pay if it's an ownership form, or a lower rent that you pay if it's and the self-build group could be a co-op, or it could be a community land trust. So it's more a method rather than a type. And finally, almshouses. And it's important to remember that almshouses have been here for ages. The earliest is thought to date back to 990. As I understand it, the documentary evidence only goes back to the 13th century, but still long enough for my liking. And overall, there are 1,600 or so almshouses. Usually people know of one or two in their local vicinity and don't realise there's that many. I think it's something like 35,000 residents altogether. So put together, almshouses are equivalent to a medium-sized housing association in terms of the amount of social housing that they provide. An almshouse trust could be renovating or refurbishing an existing building, or it could be moving residents into a purpose-built new building, or it could be expanding and creating new homes alongside the existing. There are all sorts of ways in which an almshouse could be involved in a community. Me finished, I think. Time for a glass of water and hand back.
Great, amazing. Thank you, Colin. Okay, I'll put my video back on as well. So just before I kick off questions, I'm gonna pop something in the chat box, which is just a little form that would be really grateful if you could fill out in your own time and submit. That would be really, really helpful, just so that we can get an idea, particularly in these challenging times, of what we should go forward with in the future and what's most helpful. Great, so I've had a few questions in the question and answer box. So yeah, again, feel free, either you can pop your questions there, or if you'd like to, you can raise your hand and I'll see that and I will come to you and take you off mute to ask your question. And we've also had another question, Colin and Tim, I'm sure you'll be fine with this, but from Alex, who said these slides are brilliant. Can we have them after, please? I'm sure that's okay, isn't it?
Yes, we'll definitely send the slides around to all the participants.
So that sounds good. I will do that afterwards. Cool. So if I ask our first couple of questions. So What is the likely availability of funding through community-led housing or other government sources, given the massive increase in government debt in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic? A timely question. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll give a general answer, which was that specific funding for community-led homes ended pretty much at the end of March, so yesterday. There was a big lobbying attempt to try and have the community-led homes fund extended for another year. And then we were told that in the spending review that was anticipated for the autumn, that it was likely that further allocations of community-led housing funds would be made available, but no commitments were made. So that was the sort of slightly frustrating situation before we got hit by coronavirus. So beyond coronavirus, it's very difficult to say. But I mean, my experience sort of over the last 15 years of working in community-led housing is that, you know, we went through the 2008 financial crisis. There's been other sort of chopping and changing, but ultimately it's accepted that we need to be building at least 300,000 houses a year to meet the demand. So I don't think that's going to go away. And we just have to hope that the government acknowledges the importance of community-led housing as part of that wider effort. But Colin, you probably have a more specific answer to that.
If I could add to that, I think the Chancellor announced, I think it was £12 billion for the Affordable Homes Programme for the 5 years, I think starting in 2021. And of course, anything that happens in the current state, so it's possible the government may review that and decide to put less or more in, but as far as we know, it's £12 billion over the 5 years. But that's not, as Tim said, that's not for community-led homes specifically, that's for all forms of affordable housing provided by registered providers, so housing associations and the like, over that time period. However, we don't know how much of that might be set aside for community-led housing. And in any case, there's nothing stopping community-led groups from applying for that main source of funding anyway, either as I mentioned in the presentation, either as a registered provider in their own right or by partnering with an existing housing association. That fund. The other thing I wanted to say was that there's also some local housing authorities, or rather some local planning authorities, may have some community sums that they've had through planning agreements where the developer has been able to argue that they are not going to provide any obligated affordable housing on the site, and it might be that they would be able to deploy some of those funds to the community-led scheme. That's down to the individual council. So other sources of funding may also be available, but I think it is very much a case that the whole sector is looking at what picture might emerge now and.
Great. Perfect. Thank you. All right. Thank you for that question, Simon. So on to the next question. I've heard of a CLT/CBS converting to a charity in order to protect their houses from right to buy. How big is this threat, and how does this step provide better protection? Let me know if you want me to read it again. Did you catch that? Sorry.
We did.
Yeah. Hannah, could you just, I heard you blip a bit, so could you just read it again?
I'll read it again. Great. So I've heard of a CLT/CBS converting to a charity in order to protect their houses from right to buy. How big is this threat, and how does this step provide better protection?
Right, well, I'll have a go at that. I suspect it's the subject of another webinar, but it really depends on what your status is as to whether you're affected by the right to buy or the proposed voluntary right to buy. Generally, for a lot of community-led housing schemes, they're not affected by it anyway, because it will come down to whether they are registered provider in their own right, whether the homes are being provided by a housing association on that land, and the housing association might be affected by the obligations under their grant funding, but also what protections there might be for the scheme under the planning agreement that it's been built under. So it's highly complicated, but I think there are a number of ways of ensuring that homes are kept for local people in perpetuity, and that on the whole, to date, we haven't had the issue of the right to buy eroding community-led housing schemes. Of course, what we have had is the right to buy extended to some housing association tenants, and also some previous council tenants who take a preserved right to buy with them when they become a housing association tenant. And so we have seen a disproportionate loss of properties in rural areas where they're more popular through the existence of the preserved right to buy. Those tend to be properties that aren't under a community-led housing scheme and or aren't under the protection of a specific planning agreement, a Section 106 agreement, which will ensure properties are kept there in perpetuity. There's also another let out with designated areas where housing associations can put certain properties being protected. As with everything, it's always the case that any future government could legislate anything. So there's no absolute guarantee that in that sense, but as far as we know, a community-led scheme is a very good way of preserving properties in perpetuity. And it may not matter so much whether you're a charity or not a charity, whether you're a community benefit society, or whether you're one of the other forms, one of the other legal forms of the community.
Great, excellent. Okay, so on to the next question by Stefan. He's asked, we had also a COVID-19 related question, but I think that was answered at the beginning. He's also asked, will you be able to come to our parish and address the council? Sort of what's the offer from the Wessex Community Housing Hub? Sort of what are we able to extend in terms of resources?
Shall I try answering that one as well?
Yeah.
I'd love to come and see some parish councils. At the moment, I can't. I think that's the way it is for all of us at the moment. And I've been willing to go and see some parish councils who've decided they're not meeting, which is also understandable. I think for the moment, we're going to have to communicate with each other like this, with all the technical problems that we might have, and not being able to sort of see people face to face. And as soon as everyone thinks it's safe to do so, and if the Derbyshire police aren't sending a drone after me, I will certainly come to your parish council if you want.
Good, a good answer in after times. Lovely. So I've got a question from Alex, which he says, how complicated is it to set up a partnership with a housing association? I know this is dependent on specific circumstances. Have you worked with any examples of multiple housing associations to set up a collaborative model?
Shall I have a go at this one as well? It is complicated, but also a partnership with a housing association is probably the thing that Wessex has the greatest experience of. So, although in theory it's complicated, it's a path that's well trodden. And going back to one of the things that Tim said earlier, one of the things we can do is provide some peer-to-peer support. So probably rather than me attempt to answer this, it might be better if that's the sort of thing that people talked about amongst themselves. I've forgotten who that question was from now, but whoever it was asking that question, addressing that question to someone who's an existing community land trust that has partnered with a housing association, who will probably very happily tell you the warts and all version. but it is certainly possible to do. I'm not sure about the other thing. I think was about multiple partners, and I'm not too sure about that. I think inevitably the more organisations that are involved, the more complicated it will get in terms of what your sort of legal partnership status is. But again, Tim mentioned Granby Four Streets in Liverpool, and I know that that scheme involved at least 2 different housing associations, and it is something that can be done and something we're willing to look into. I don't think, though, unfortunately, it lends itself to a quick answer in this format. And I think we're beginning to build up a bank of things to have possible future webinars about.
Yeah. So on the flip side of that question, Sue has asked, can you give examples of community-led housing projects that haven't involved a housing association?
Well, again, if you go back to Tim's slides, you'll see that there were a couple of examples, particularly in the earlier days, of some community land trusts that were acting alone. I think my view of that is, well, I think I said that in my presentation, that one of the advantages of working with an existing housing association is they've got all the skills and resources there, and will be able to do all the heavy lifting. And there may be some advantages to acting alone and independently. You have to weigh up the additional burden of registering and setting yourselves up and so on against what your extra control you're gaining from that. Again, I kind of feel that that would be something that other people could comment on that have actually done it. And it's unfortunate that in switching to this webinar format, we've taken away the chance to talk to some of the people who've done it in the past, and maybe that's something else we could agree to arrange in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I think
Cool.
it's just worth adding to that. Most of the projects that we've seen across Devon, Dorset and Somerset in the last 10 years have been partnerships between community land trusts and housing associations. And that's been particularly important where communities have identified a need for social rented accommodation, but then the community doesn't feel it has the capacity to become a registered provider, be able to draw down grant that you need to be able to provide social rented accommodation. I think what we've begun to see over the last 3 or 4 years across the country is a lot more examples of community-led housing groups that are developing other types of housing, so self-build or mutual home ownership, for example, where they haven't either they've been able to access grant directly themselves, or they haven't accessed grant. And so I think, as Colin says, we've been looking at the possibility of doing more webinars. I think one of the benefits, although clearly there are challenges of getting 50 people online and getting the bandwidth, etc., one of the benefits is that we have connections with community-led housing projects across the country, and we've talked with some of those about them being able to offer input into future webinars. So I think if people have sort of suggestions for those kind of webinars, then we can follow up and make the connections and invite people from other parts of the country to share their experience, and I think that that would be very valuable.
Yeah. Brilliant. Okay, that sounds good. Cool. I think, yeah, we've still got another 7-ish minutes, so we'll see if we can get a couple more questions in. Michael has asked, I think this might have come up in your slides, Tim, how do we connect with the Innovation Forum?
Well, I'm sort of leading on that area for Wessex. We have a little bit of funding from the Nationwide Foundation to help us to explore innovation, and I'm also doing a PhD at Plymouth University on that topic. So I'm very keen to hear from anybody who's interested in innovation, and hopefully you have my email address when we send around the slides. It'll be on that. So please get in touch if that's an area that you're interested in.
Nice, brilliant. Okay, question from Dave, asking, are there groups with a common interest that individuals could join to take forward? So any pre-existing groups. Says, I have in mind someone with electrosensitivity who is looking for a self or community build option that could meet their special needs. So I suppose, yeah, the question is, yeah, are there any sort of places where we can convene to find groups?
Yeah, it's a good good point. I mean, obviously, most of the community-led housing groups that have come forward connect with a particular locality, so there's a kind of geographical community. But there's no reason why a community of interest couldn't come together. And if there's any way that Wessex, we could help to publicise that particular interest, then obviously, again, get in touch, and we'll do whatever we can through our newsletter or other means to highlight that particular community of interest. Because there's no reason why the co-housing project, for example, couldn't revolve around that community of interest. We've seen it, for example, in London. There's a co-housing project for older women, for example. So yeah, that's certainly an area that could be explored.
Great. Question from Alex. Does a CLT have any more powers to get rural exception sites through planning committees than a private developer?
I'm going to give that to Colin.
Yeah, can I answer a different question? I'm not sure that it has any more power. I think the issue is from the planning perspective, whether you're a community-led scheme or whether you're a private scheme, do you have the evidence in place that justifies building what it is that you want to build? And often, when that's outside of the normal boundaries, that would be limited to things like, here is a need for affordable housing for local people. So I think a private scheme could develop, provide affordable housing, less sub-market rate for local people, just as much as community-led scheme could. But community-led scheme, I think, is more likely to, because it will have the motivation to do it. Whereas, if I'm a private sector developer, why would I do that when I could concentrate my time on developing a scheme that I can sell at full price on a different site? And I think the issue for me is not so much the power as what is the quality or the essence of the scheme that you will get as a result. And it may be that a community-led scheme is going to have much more to give it the ability to get the planning permission in the first place, by virtue of being able to tick the right boxes, because it's done the community consultation, knows what the local issues are, knows how to get houses built in the local vernacular, the local area, and all the sensitivities that maybe a private builder wouldn't have. But, that's never to say never. I mean, private builders can do more philanthropic works if they want to.
So it looks like we've got 2 minutes left, and we've got two questions to answer. So maybe we can do 1 minute on each.
That sounds like a good idea.
I mean, just very briefly, I think, again, these ones are for Colin. Colin, can you see the questions? It's in the top right-hand corner. So the first question is about how to establish need. So this was from Sally Boyton, and it's saying, we've circulated a sort of questionnaire to 700 people. We've had about a 10% response, but we still don't feel that we're reaching a large enough audience of people who could potentially be interested in affordable housing. And so then the question is, how do we ensure our research provides enough evidence of need to enable us to partner with a housing association? i.e. how large does our response need to be taken seriously?
Okay. I think I'm getting slightly confused actually, because we've got 2 things in chat and 4 things in Q&A, and I wasn't sure which ones we were talking about. So I don't think we will have time to cover them all, unfortunately. But just very briefly on that one, for other people, we haven't said anything about how you evidence need, and yes, it is quite common that you'd have a local housing needs survey, particularly in a rural area. I don't think there's any right or wrong answers to have you got the right number back, what percentage is it, and so on. I think if you've got a very low return and a very low percentage return, what that return shows you is you've got a particular, a definite number of people in housing need, and that gives you the evidence that you need to justify building a particular number of houses. So, you might have surveyed 700 people, got 70 back, found that you've got need for 7 people, and thought that's a very low return, but actually those 7 people in housing, that's all the evidence you need and permission for the houses, all other things being equal. I think there are other ways of then engaging with the rest of the community. And what we often find is that people will engage at different stages. So though it's ideal that people would fill in a survey form at the beginning, it might be that they don't, and it might be only when you've actually got to the site and plan stage and you have a wider public meeting about what your initial plans are for the site. It might be then that other people start to come out of the woodwork once they believe that something's actually going to happen. Often it's the case that people don't get engaged or they themselves have a belief it's going to happen. So I think the technical answer is that it's often for planning reasons that you need evidence rather than for any reasons, partnering with a housing association or whoever, because they will have different criteria as to whether they think they want to partner with you. As I said, it doesn't matter what the size of the return is, it's quality, not quantity, that matters.
Lovely, great. All right, and then let's just have one final question, couple more minutes. So David has said, I'd be interested in the options for ensuring housing remains for local people in perpetuity, even if the property is owned by its occupant. We have a demand for affordable houses to rent and also to buy, perhaps by self-build. He says, I recognise this may be a topic for a future webinar, but yeah, question being, even if it's housing remains for local people in perpetuity, even if the property is owned by an occupant.
I mean, I think not just to sort of bat away the question, but I think that would be a good topic for a future webinar. So, for example, Cornwall Community Land Trust, our partners who run the hub down there, they've done quite a lot of work around what are called discounted market sales of housing. And so the issue there is around how do you both maintain the affordability in perpetuity, but also how do you ensure that when houses are resold, they are made available to local people or people with a local connection. So yes, that would be a very good topic for a future webinar.
Great. And to wrap up there, yeah, if you could, thank you so much everyone for joining us. So I put in the webinar chat a link to Typeform. If you'd be interested in any future webinars, we'd love to know sort of what perspective you're approaching community-led housing from. So if you wouldn't mind taking a couple of minutes to send that out and submit that, we'd be really grateful, because then hopefully in the near future you'll see some more things coming out from the Wessex Community Housing Hub. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch, please do. I will put Colin's email into the chat box as well, as sort of the first port of call for the Wessex Community Housing Hub.
Yeah, so thank you everyone for joining. I think we had about 50 people on the call today, and I think the technology just about managed to hold up. Sorry if the sound wasn't brilliant, but it was great to have so many people, and let's stay in touch.
Brilliant, great. All right, thanks so very much everyone. Take care, bye-bye.